There are moments in the life of a democracy when something happens quietly. No press conferences, no dramatic announcements, just a phone call. Then another, then the understanding that something somewhere has caught the attention of people whose job it is to pay attention to things that matter. That's where we are now. Over the past several weeks, reports indicate that the Federal Bureau of Investigation has been conducting closed-door questioning of Democratic lawmakers. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. Enough that staffers have noticed. Enough that Capitol Hill insiders have begun speaking in hushed tones about what this might mean. Enough that the pattern itself has become undeniable. What's striking, what should be striking to anyone paying attention, is how little this has registered in the broader political conversation. We live in an age where every political tremor becomes a cable news earthquake. Every whisper becomes a headline, and yet this deliberate, methodical investigation into sitting members of Congress has been met with something approaching silence. That silence is not accidental. The questioning appears connected to matters of campaign finance irregularities and what sources describe as potential misuse of official resources. But the specifics remain deliberately obscure. The FBI, as is their practice, is not commenting. The lawmakers being questioned are not speaking publicly. Their counsel has advised them to remain silent. And so, in that silence, a vacuum forms. And into that vacuum, questions rush. Who exactly is being questioned? What specifically triggered this investigation? How high does this go? And perhaps most importantly, why are Democratic leadership and their allies not addressing this head-on? Why the defensive crouch? Why the hope, it seems, that if they don't talk about it, perhaps it will simply go away? These are not abstract questions. They go to something fundamental about how power operates in this country, about whether there are rules that apply equally or whether those rules bend depending on which party you belong to, about whether institutional accountability still functions or whether it has become simply another weapon in a larger political war. The FBI doesn't move lightly. They don't quietly question members of Congress without cause. And they certainly don't do it in a way that leaves this kind of trace, this kind of awareness among insiders, unless they believe something significant has occurred. So let's trace this back. Let's understand how we got here, and let's ask the questions that everyone should be asking, but so few are. To understand why the FBI is asking questions, you have to understand what triggered them in the first place. And that requires going back further than the headlines have taken us. The origins of this investigation appear rooted in campaign finance documentation. Specifically, reports indicate that several Democratic campaigns reported unusually large consulting expenditures to firms that, upon examination, appeared to have minimal substantive output. The money went in, the services, however, remained unclear. This alone might have been dismissed as bureaucratic sloppiness or accounting confusion. Political campaigns are chaotic operations. Money flows in complicated ways. But what emerged from initial inquiry was something more deliberate, more structured. The pattern suggested not accident, but design. Multiple campaigns, multiple consulting firms, multiple lawmakers, all connected by a web of financial transactions that, when mapped out, began to suggest coordination. Not coordination in the sense of conspiracy, that word carries weight and requires proof, but coordination in the sense of a repeating pattern, a methodology, a way of doing things. Sources close to the investigation suggest that what caught the FBI's attention was not any single transaction, but rather the consistency of the pattern across different campaigns in different states, over an extended period. When you see the same structure repeated again and again, you begin to ask whether structure is intentional. The consulting firms involved operate in a gray zone that exists throughout American politics. They are real companies with real employees conducting real work. But the nature of that work, political consulting, strategic communications, campaign management, is deliberately vague. It's difficult to measure, it's difficult to verify. And that difficulty is perhaps precisely the point. Here's where it gets darker. Some of these firms appear to have been funneling portions of their payments to other entities entirely. Secondary transfers, hidden layers, the kind of financial architecture that doesn't exist to clarify where money goes, but rather to obscure it. Now, this isn't unique to Democrats. Campaign finance has always operated in the shadows in some respects. Both parties have developed sophisticated mechanisms for moving money in ways that test the boundaries of legality without always crossing them. It's one of the ways the system functions. Everyone knows it, few speak about it directly. But there's a difference between the gray area that everyone operates within in a pattern so clear, so repeated, so systematic, that it suggests something beyond the normal workings of political fundraising. The FBI believes they've found that difference, and that's why the questioning began. But here's where this becomes something larger than a campaign finance scandal. Because when you look closely at what the FBI appears to be investigating, it's not really about money in the abstract sense. It's about what that money represents, what it purchased, and what it reveals about the state of American institutions. Campaign finance rules exist for a reason. They exist because in a democracy, we are supposed to believe that votes are not for sale, that elected officials are supposed to answer to their constituents, not to their largest donors, that there is a bright line between legitimate political activity and corruption. The investigation, as reported, suggests that line has become substantially less bright. Think about what the pattern indicates. If the early reports are accurate, money flows from donors, often wealthy individuals or corporate interests, into campaigns. Those campaigns then funnel that money to consulting firms, often without competitive bidding, often without the scrutiny that would normally apply. Those consulting firms then perform services that are difficult to measure and therefore difficult to challenge. And in the process, the donor has effectively purchased access and influence while maintaining plausible deniability throughout the process. It's not a bribe in the traditional sense. No one is handing someone an envelope of cash in exchange for a specific vote. It's far more sophisticated than that. It's the construction of a system where influence flows naturally through normal channels, where it becomes impossible to distinguish between legitimate political activity and corrupt intent because they have merged into the same action. And the FBI apparently has decided that this merger requires examination. What's particularly concerning to analysts and observers is what this suggests about institutional capacity. The Federal Election Commission, the agency ostensibly responsible for policing campaign finance, has become effectively toothless. It's underfunded, it's deadlocked between Democratic and Republican commissioners who often cannot agree on basic enforcement action. It has become less a watchdog and more a symbol of a system that has abandoned the pretense of self-regulation, which is why the FBI has had to step in, which is precisely what you see when institutional structures fail to do their intended job. Other institutions eventually move to fill the vacuum. The question is what happens when they do. When law enforcement begins investigating patterns of political financing, who decides where that investigation stops? What counts as corruption? What gets ignored? Does the investigation itself become a weapon wielded selectively against opponents? These questions matter more than any particular scandal, because they go to whether institutions themselves, the very mechanisms by which democracies are supposed to govern themselves, are still capable of functioning. And it's worth thinking carefully about because it reveals something important about how politics actually works, as opposed to how we're told it works. You have an ongoing FBI investigation. You have members of your party being questioned, yet the potential for indictments, convictions, and serious legal jeopardy for people who have been your colleagues, your allies, sometimes your friends. What do you do? Option 1. You come forward. You acknowledge the investigation. You express commitment to accountability. You distance yourself from any wrongdoing and signal to law enforcement that you are not interested in protecting members who may have violated the law. This is the high ground strategy. It's also the high risk strategy. Option 2. You say nothing. You hope the investigation moves slowly. You hope it's stalled. You hope that it eventually concludes without major indictments. Or that the indictments, if they come, involve people obscure enough that they don't damage the broader party narrative. This is the hope and wait strategy. It carries its own risks, but they are risks that unfold over time, not immediately. The evidence suggests that Democratic leadership has chosen option 2. There has been no statement from House leadership, no statement from the Democratic National Committee, no op-eds from prominent party figures expressing commitment to the rule of law and consequences for wrongdoing. There has been, instead, a coordinated silence, a refusal to engage, a strategy of hoping that if enough people don't talk about it, eventually the story will fade. This silence is itself informative. It suggests that Democratic leadership understands something about this investigation that they are not saying publicly. It suggests that they believe the investigation may in fact expand, that it may in fact reach higher than the members currently being questioned, that the interests being protected by this silence may be broader than any single individual. Or perhaps the silence simply reflects a calculation that any statement would be used against them, that in a polarized environment, any acknowledgement of wrongdoing would be weaponized by opponents. that the safest play is to say nothing and hope that the investigation's normal pace allows time for political winds to shift, for new scandals to emerge, for attention to move elsewhere. That's a very modern political calculation. It's a recognition that in a world where narrative matters as much as fact, where attention is scarce and moving constantly, the best defense against a scandal is not to address it, but to wait for something else to capture the public imagination. The danger of this approach, however, is that it assumes the investigation itself will remain quiet. It assumes that the FBI will not leak. It assumes that the members being questioned will remain silent. It assumes that journalists will not press for answers. In an environment where all of those assumptions may be violated simultaneously, the danger is that what begins as silence becomes eventually a narrative of cover-up. And this brings us to the questions that should be asked, but are not being asked loudly enough. First, what exactly is being investigated? We have hints, we have suggestions, we have reports from sources, but we do not have clarity. And in a democracy, clarity matters. The NUF has a right to understand, at least in broad terms, what their law enforcement agencies are doing and why. The current approach, where the investigation proceeds in shadow, where the specifics remain obscure, where the public is left to piece together fragments of information from leaks and insider accounts. This is not how justice is supposed to function. Second, how far does this go? Are we talking about isolated instances of financial mismanagement, or a systematic pattern involving dozens of lawmakers and significant sums of money? Does this investigation touch national party leadership, or is it confined to individual campaigns? The scope matters, because it determines whether this is a problem to be solved through accountability of individuals, or whether it's a problem that requires rethinking how campaigns are financed at the most basic level. Third, where is the consistency and enforcement? Campaign finance violations, if they are occurring, are not unique to Democrats. Both parties have operated in the gray zones of campaign finance laws. If the FBI is investigating Democratic campaigns with this level of intensity, where is the equivalent investigation into Republican campaign finance irregularity? The answer to that question, whether it exists or whether it does not, tells us something important about whether institutions are functioning fairly or whether they have become weapons in a larger political conflict. And fourth, what does this reveal about the state of our democratic institution? The fact that it has taken an FBI investigation to surface problems that should have been caught by the Federal Election Commission, by party internal audits, by basic oversight structures, this suggests that the normal mechanisms of accountability have become substantially compromised. This suggests that we are in a position where informal power, money, and networks matter more than formal rules. And that is a condition that over time corrodes democracy itself. These questions don't have clean answers. The investigation itself will eventually provide some clarity. Indictments, if they come, will provide more. But in the meantime, the silence, the coordinated unwillingness of Democratic leadership to engage with this moment, that silence itself is an answer. It's an answer to the question of whether those in power believe they are accountable to the same rules that bind everyone else. We know how democracies die. They don't die in moments of dramatic rupture. They die slowly, through the gradual erosion of institutions, through the normalization of corruption, through the replacement of rules with relationships. They die when people in power decide that the rules no longer apply to them, and when they make that decision, they rarely announce it. They simply stop talking about it, and hope that eventually everyone else stops talking about it too. That's what we're watching now, not the death of democracy, but perhaps one of its warning signs. And that's why everyone should be talking about what the FBI is quietly investigating, but they're not. And that silence too is part of the story.